about all of the books that I read in January, and there's actually quite a lot of them, so we need to get stuck right in. Firstly though, we need to go over some stats. Some of these come from the story graph, some of them also come from the spreadsheet that I've been using this year. So in January, I finished 21 books. I also started another book that I decided to DNF, and my total numbers of pages read was 5,853 pages. According to the story graph, most of the moods that I was reading were adventurous, lighthearted, and mysterious. And I read a pretty even split of medium and fast-paced books with a little less of the slow-paced books this month. About 2/3 of the books that I read were under 300 pages, 29% were between 300 and 500, and just one book was over 500 pages this month. There was a pretty even spread of my star ratings, although I had an awful lot of 3.5 reads. These are the genres that the story graph says that I read a lot of this month. However, I've been tracking the primary genres of the books that I'm reading by myself in my spreadsheet, and that says that I've read 6 fantasy books, 5 paranormal, 4 mystery, 2 sci-fi, and 1 each for contemporary, literary fiction, memoir, poetry, and romance. One of the reasons that I wanted to track some things myself is because the story graph seems to kind of lump in intended audience with the genre, and to me, I wanted those separate. And so the intended audiences of the books that I was reading were, I have 13 adult books, 1 young adult, and 8 middle grade. And then I've also been tracking the way that I consumed these books. The story graph kind of does this too, but I don't really feel like it does it very accurately all the time. So I listened to 1 audiobook, read 1 ebook. I read 11 books physically, and then I read 9 books in like a mixture of modes. So usually that is when I've got the physical book in front of me and I'm listening to it as well. As I mentioned, I DNF'd 1 book, and then apparently I started 7 new series. Now that just means that I read the first book that is in a series. The vast majority of these I have no intention of continuing on with those series. And then 15 of the 22 books that I read I classed as diverse reads in some way. Obviously tracking things like this can be a bit subjective and often quite tricky, but essentially this just means that the book had some pretty clear representation of some kind of underrepresented or minority group. But those are my stats, so now we can get into actually talking about the books that I read. And I suppose we'll just kick it off with the book that I DNF'd or did not finish. And that was The Keeper's Six by Kate Elliott. I received an e-arc of this through NetGalley. This is a new release, very short fantasy novel. I've heard some people call it a novella. I don't know that it technically is, but it's very short either way. Despite it being very short, I really struggled to get through it and I DNF'd at page 73. Kate Elliott is an author that I've been wanting to try for a while, so I was really excited to get approved for this arc. And I was really excited by the premise too. It's like a really fun, lighthearted, rompy kind of story that's basically a magical heist with dragons, and our main protagonist is a grandma. It sounded so fun, and to be perfectly honest, there were elements of this that I really enjoyed. I laughed out loud a couple of times. I loved how diverse and interesting the cast was. I also loved that we had some agitation for a union movement for people who were working for a hoarding dragon. So there were a lot of elements here that I did really like. However, it was the narration and the writing that I just really couldn't get into. For me, it just felt a little bit clunky, and then what just kept taking me out of this story time and time again was the author's tendency to over-explain things to us as readers. There were moments in this that I found really like intriguing and emotionally poignant, but then the author would just kind of stop the story to take the time, sometimes like a page or two, to just like explain what had happened and why and what it meant. Often this was done through dialogue, but it was that kind of dialogue that feels entirely unnecessary to the actual conversation of the characters, and it just feels like a character talking at you. And this is something that I've discovered more and more when I've been reading genre fiction that I just really dislike in storytelling. And to me, it does feel a little bit like the author not trusting the reader, but it's even more than that for me. To me, it feels like it takes away from my emotional and very personal experience of the book. I mean, not only does that kind of mess with the pacing, but it ultimately just diminishes my own personal investment and engagement with the story. Ironically, it felt like there were some world building elements that were not explained or fleshed out very well. And so I felt kind of confused and in the dark with some things while being over explained others. And I just didn't enjoy that experience. So I really love the concept of this book. I felt like it had a lot of potential. And if those aren't things that really bother you as a reader, I think this could probably be a great story, but it didn't work for me. And so unfortunately I DNF'd at 35%. Hi, it's the next day. Due to technical difficulties, we've had to refilm most of this video. That explains the outfit change. Now let's keep talking about books. At the beginning of the month, I made myself a TBR for January, or a to be read pile. It looked like this. There were 11 books that I picked out for myself at the beginning of the month that I wanted to get to in January. And obviously, given that I read 21 books in January, I feel like it was a good number. And I had that TBR in a little checklist on my notes app, and I actually did pretty well. I read all but 2 of the books that I put on my TBR, and the 2 that I didn't read, I have very good reasons for not reading. So let's talk about the books that were on my TBR that I did get to. Firstly, we had A Symphony of Echoes by Jodi Taylor. This is the 2nd book in the Chronicles of St. Mary series. This is a rompy time travel sci-fi series that I absolutely fell in love with when I read the first book last month. It features our fun and feisty main character Max, who's an archaeologist, and in the first book she joins a secret society of historians who, rather than studying history in like the regular way, they travel back in time to observe historical events instead. And honestly, it feels a little bit like Doctor Who. It's quite fun, it's quite rompy, and time travel is messy as hell. These are very fast-paced books, and although I did like enjoy this one, I have to say I didn't enjoy it as much as the first one. I liked a lot about it, and I had a lot of fun with the first half in particular. In the second half of the book, there was a particular decision that was made by Max, our main character, that one part of me appreciates because it does really highlight the moral ambiguity and like the grey morality of like traveling in time and how messy that can be. The other part of me though absolutely hated that decision, and it left me with a big ick. Like I said, part of me likes that we don't have perfect characters, and like the messiness and the trickiness and the tangledness of time travel is really being highlighted with situations like this. But I suppose this series is coming into contact with one of the problems that a lot of stories about time travel have. And I think that ultimately comes down to a choice of whether they have, you know, like multiple realities, multiple timelines, or whether there's one set true timeline that has to be like protected. And in this book, this series seems to have clearly landed on the side of like a one true timeline. And I do understand that choice for like actually writing a series that is going to make sense and that readers can follow. But I think what can sometimes happen when stories choose to do like a one true timeline thing, it can feel like they opt out of really wrestling with some of the consequences of bad choices. Like if a character does something immoral or wrong or harmful, it can be kind of explained away by, oh, well, that's what needed to happen in order to keep the timeline straight, if that makes sense. I don't know. I'm basically left feeling a little bit more conflicted than I did with the first book, but I still enjoyed it overall. And although it wasn't on my TBR, I did also read the short story that kind of follows on from book 2. It seems to me like the short stories don't have to be read if you're reading the series. They're just kind of like a little bonus extra. And I liked it. It was kind of sweet. I liked that there was a little bit of like gender critique throughout and a subversion of both our assumptions as a reader, but also a challenging of the assumptions that Max, our main character, is making. So I liked but did not love my Chronicles of St. Mary's experience this month, but I'm still looking forward to continuing the series. Next on my TBR was In the Labyrinth of Drakes, a Lady Trent memoir by Marie Brennan. This is the 4th book in the Lady Trent series, and this was my favourite book of the month. I loved it so much. This is already a series I've really been enjoying, but this book I think is the best in the series so far and has like elevated the series for me to like, I don't know, potential favourite status. I did a vlog this month reading some more like lighthearted, fun, cozy fantasy. I would not really describe this as cozy, but there's something about it that is quite fun. So if you'd like to hear my thoughts in more detail, definitely check that vlog out. I'll leave it in the cards above for you. I love that in this volume we got a lot of dragon talk. And Isabella, our main character, as always, was really having to challenge herself in terms of her morals and what it was that she was setting out to do in studying dragons. And I did feel like that was tackled in a really honest and raw kind of way. And I really love some of the character development and development in terms of some of the relationships, and that we got to revisit some characters we've gotten to know in previous books. This was just an absolute highlight of both the series and of my month. I loved it. Another book that I read in that same vlog was Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry. Of course, you can't have a cozy fantasy reading vlog without reading Legends and Lattes. And I mean, if you watch that vlog, you already know I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. I didn't even actively dislike it. To me, it just felt very mid. Our main character, Viv, this green orc, she's been a warrior her whole life, and she's decided to retire, settle down, and open her own coffee shop. And in this world, coffee is not very widely known. Obviously, this is billed as a novel of high fantasy and low stakes, and I enjoyed the low stakes factor, but I think if you're going to aim for low stakes, the characters and the atmosphere have to do a lot of the legwork, and at least for me, these characters were serviceable, but they were not exceptional like I was hoping they would be. And I always hear people describe this as a sapphic cozy fantasy, and while that is technically true, I think you should be forewarned that the sapphic element of this is very minimal. So it was sweet and it was cute, and I am glad that I finally read it, but it just was not anything particularly special to me. Another book that I read in that same vlog was The Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels by India Holton. This was honestly pretty fast-paced and very action-packed, but it was also very, very, very heavy on the romance element, And the tone of this was absolutely hilarious in so many ways. This is a story about Victorian ladies who are also pirates, but instead of ships, like, they can fly their houses around. At the beginning, we're introduced to a character named Cecilia, who is a young woman aspiring to become part of the Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels. And we discover that somebody, a rival, has hired an assassin to assassinate Cecilia. And Cecilia is thrilled to discover this because she figures it's going to, like, really up her street cred. And to top it off, when she meets her assassin, like, sparks fly, the banter is on point. So it is an absolutely ridiculous, like, pirate fantasy set in the Victorian era. And it's kind of like this absurd heist, but it's also this very fun romance. And this book spends a lot of time making fun of, like, what are basically incels and the patriarchy. And, like, I was here for that. This was by no means something I would describe as memorable or a favorite, but I did have quite a lot of fun reading it. And continuing on with the books that I read in that cozy, fun fantasy reading vlog, I also did read Volume 5 of Natsume's Book of Friends. I was hoping to get to at least one volume this month. Volume 5 is what I read in that vlog, and it is my favorite of the series so far. I absolutely loved it. Afterwards, though, I did get to another 4 volumes, so I ended up reading 5 Natsume volumes this month, which I feel like is some really good progress on a series that I've really been enjoying, but is quite long. This is a story about a teenage boy named Natsume who can see yokai. They are spirits. And they've caused him quite a lot of grief in his life because obviously nobody else can see these spirits and what they're up to. And while he used to resent them as a young boy, he's now coming to kind of like them and have quite a soft spot for these yokai. And these are just like really cute stories about the interactions that Natsume has with these spirits. So although it is supernatural and it's basically about ghosts and spirits, it does have quite a fun, cozy vibe. So Volume 5 has definitely been my favorite of the whole series so far, and overall I'm just really enjoying it. Then another book that was on my TBR that I did also read in a vlog, but this book got its own whole video. It was The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This was one of the biggest books on my shelf, so I was pretty proud of myself getting this out of the way in January. However, I was hugely disappointed in this book. I think it's my least favorite read of the month. This is a high fantasy story with 4 main points of view, and I would tell you about the plot, but essentially it's just a story about good and evil. It's pretty basic, it's very derivative, and there is just such a lack of development throughout. The plot, the themes, and especially the characters just lacked any depth to me. I was especially disappointed in the antagonist and in the ending and how the problems of this world were supposedly resolved. I did give some more spoilery thoughts about why I disliked this book so much in my reading vlog, which I'll leave a link to in the cards above for you if you want to watch that. But here I'll just go so far as to say that we spend 700 pages of this book building up to what feels like an insurmountable challenge, only to have it overcome within the matter of pages and like one conversation. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous how poorly the stakes are handled in this. I know some people absolutely love this book, but to me, the best thing about it is the cover. One of the other books that I had on my TBR that I did get to this month is The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nghi. It's a very short fantasy novella that I just really enjoyed. I don't want to speak too much about the plot of this one because like it is so short, and honestly, it's kind of simple too. Like, primarily we have 2 characters in this book. One of our characters is this kind of like record keeper or story collector who is listening to the life story of an elderly woman. So a lot of this book is just taken up by us listening to this woman telling her story. Some of it is also interactions between these 2 characters, and there's just such an incredible sense of atmosphere throughout. And one thing that I was just honestly in awe of throughout was how like self-assured and steady this all felt. Like, it contained quite a lot of story, quite a lot of world building and theme development, and in such a short book, like, it never felt like it was rushing or like it was trying to pack a bunch of things in. Instead, it all just felt so intentional and honestly just quite poignant. I really enjoyed this. The writing was absolutely beautiful. I finished this in one sitting and immediately knew that this is a book that I would want to return to in future. Another book that I put on the TBR was The Rocket Power Racing Caravan by C.E. Hayes. This was a book that I was commissioned by Books and Publishing to write a review for. So it's behind a paywall, but if you happen to have a subscription to Books and Publishing in Australia, you can read my review over there. This is an Australian middle grade book that's coming out in March this year, and I had a lot of fun reading this. It's essentially the year in the life of our main character Earl Grey, who is a year 7 student. And yes, his name is Earl Grey. His mother figured with a surname like that, she really only had one option, and honestly, iconic. At some point, Earl gets in his head that the one thing he needs to survive grade 7 is to get himself kind of like a little hideaway, somewhere for him and his friends to hang out. So with his life savings, which is $27, and a promise to work 6 months shoveling poo at the local racing course, Earl buys buys himself a very rundown, beaten up old caravan. And he and his friends kind of do this little caravan up, and it's where they hang out. It's written kind of like it's the diary of Earl over the space of a year. And so we follow him as he goes on his first date, which is like an absolute mess, obviously, as he deals with mountains of homework and hangs out with his genius little sister. It's basically just a story about a group of 4 kids who are best mates in a small Australian town, and just the little silly hijinks that they get up to throughout the year. Earl himself was such a playful, upbeat, optimistic narrator. It honestly kind of reminded me of like The Castle, but like the lighter version of that. Everything about this just feels so Australian, and when this comes out in March, I will be happily recommending this to readers 10 and over. One of my goals for this year was to listen to more of my Libro FM books that I get given through the ALC program. So on my TBR, I just wrote down to listen to a Libro FM book. I didn't really mind which one. In the end, I decided on Superfan, How Pop Culture Broke My Heart by Jen Sukfong Lee. Jen is an author who honestly I had not heard of before, and basically this is her memoir. And it is told somewhat chronologically, but she sort of like divides different parts of her life and connects them to really important like pop culture moments or like TV shows, movies, music that she was listening to and that really influenced and helped frame her experience at that time. Like she touches on everything from Anne of Green Gables to Princess Diana, Gwyneth Paltrow, Bob Ross, Rihanna, and I really enjoyed the framing. I really enjoyed this memoir. It was a great listen. Now for the 2 books that I did not get to that I put on my TBR, they are The Daughters of Istahar and The Mysterious Case of the Alberton Angels. These were the 2 new releases that I was interested in this month, and my reasons for these are the fact that they're new releases, and so I haven't been able to get my hands on them, partly because I've been stuck at home and have not been at work, but also The Mysterious Case of the Alberton Angels, the release date in Australia keeps getting pushed back, and now it's not due to be released until I think Valentine's Day in February. But I was still very keen to try out Janice Hallett, especially because I wanted to read a bunch of mystery books this month for my reading vlog, which I'll leave in the cards above for you. So I decided instead to pick up the Twyford Code, which was available at the bookshop just around the corner from me. So now I suppose we can talk about the books that were not on my TBR that I did read. This is obviously the first, and this was also one of my more disappointing reads of the month. This is a mystery book that centers a code that has supposedly been written into a bunch of children's books written by a classic children's author, Edith Twyford, who is essentially a stand-in for Enid Blyton. We follow a middle-aged man named Steve who's been in and out of prison quite a lot for like gang activity. We meet him after quite a long stint in prison, and he's had an awful lot of time to think, and he's been thinking over like where his life went wrong, and he keeps returning to the idea that his life went wrong the day that his school teacher, Miss Isles, went missing. He remembers vaguely one day in particular when Miss Isles took Steve and a bunch of other kids in his class to a small cottage where Edith Twyford apparently wrote some of her books. And he doesn't remember everything very clearly, but he remembers returning to school the next day and Miss Isles was nowhere to be seen. No one ever heard from her again. And so Steve starts digging into his past and getting reconnected with old schoolmates to try and figure out what happened to Miss Isles and to see how Edith Twyford's books might be connected to that disappearance. And this book is told through the transcribed voice notes that Steve has been leaving himself while he's on this investigation. So for the first half, I was really into this. But the second half, it just got a little bit ridiculous, a little bit overwritten, a little bit convoluted, and by the end, I was just kind of bored. And so although it was quite a disappointment to me, I did finish this feeling quite impressed by the ambition of this book and like the commitment to the bit, if that makes sense. Because who knows, maybe like this particular mystery just didn't work for me, but I would still like to try Janice Hallett again. I read 4 other mystery books in that same reading vlog, so definitely check that out if you'd like to hear my full thoughts on all these books. I won't talk about them too much, but we will do a little wrap up of them here. The first of the mystery books that I read in that vlog was The Agathas by Kathleen Glasgow and Liz Lawson. This is a fairly new release YA mystery story, and it is kind of inspired by Agatha Christie, and we get a lot of Agatha Christie quotes throughout. This is a story about a bunch of high school kids, and one of them goes missing one day, and the police aren't very interested in investigating what happened to this schoolgirl, so a bunch of her school friends decide to investigate themselves. Our main character, Alice, has kind of fallen out with a lot of her friends, and she was previously best friends with the girl that has now gone missing, but she's also read an awful lot of Agatha Christie, so she figures she's up to the task of investigating. I really enjoyed like all the secrets of these rich people that kept coming out, and how messy all the relationships between these teens were, and even the adults in their life too. Basically, I just loved the small town dynamic, and I had a lot of fun watching as Alice and her friends tried to figure out what had happened to Brooke. And even though I did figure out who who did it quite early on. I still just had a lot of fun reading this. That was until the very end. To me, the ending just went a little bit off the rails, but I still had a lot of fun on the journey. Next, I read the Frangipani Tree mystery by Ovidia. This is the first in the Crown Colony series, which is a cozy mystery series set in 1936 in Singapore. Our main character's name is Su Lin, and she's a disabled young woman who has big dreams of becoming a journalist and just honestly having adventures. And when the nanny at Government House mysteriously dies, and it is at first presumed an accident, Su Lin suspects that something fishy might be going on. And so she decides to fill in as the new nanny at Government House to see if she can learn more about what's going on in this house and what really happened to the previous nanny. For example, the R slur is used multiple times. One character is dehumanized quite a lot by being compared to animals. And although I was really excited to discover a cozy mystery that did tackle issues around disability and class and race and colonialism, I don't know that it always really stuck the landing for me. On top of that, there were elements of the narration and the storytelling that really didn't work for me. And so although I'm not mad that I read this, I really can't see myself continuing on with the series. Then a middle grade mystery that I decided to try out is Montgomery Bonbon Murder at the Museum. This is a proof for an upcoming release. This is what the cover is going to look like. And this is a story about a 10-year-old girl named Bonnie, who is secretly the world's greatest detective. When she's investigating, she basically transforms into a middle-aged man named Montgomery Bonbon. She wears a little coat and a little hat and a fake mustache, and her grandpa is her sidekick. So when they're out on a little day trip at the museum and somebody is murdered, obviously Bonnie needs to transform into Montgomery Bonbon to investigate what really happened. And this was just a whole lot of fun. I loved reading it and I can't wait to recommend it. My favorite book in that vlog though absolutely has to be My Sister the Serial Killer. This is a very short, punchy book. It is not like a murder mystery in the same way most of those other books are. In this, we follow a woman named Correre, whose younger sister is absolutely beautiful and beloved by everybody, but she also keeps killing her boyfriends and then asking Correre to help her clean up the mess. So there definitely are murders going on in this book, but ultimately this is a story about sisterhood, about violence, about trauma. And although it is quite dark, it's also kind of funny, and I just loved it. Now for some of the extra books that I read this month that I haven't spoken about in vlogs and that were not on my TBR. The first is Lightfall, The Girl and the Galdurian by Tim Probert. This is the first book in the Lightfall series, and it was a reread for me. This year I want to try and do a little bit more rereading because it's not something I spend a lot of time doing, but this is absolutely one of my favorite graphic novels of all time, and I just wanted to spend some more time in this world because it takes us a long time to get new volumes, and it was such a successful reread. I think I originally gave this book 4 stars, but I bumped it up to its rightful 5-star. This is one of the books that I recommend the most at work, and honestly, it is the book that I cannot help but compare every other middle grade graphic novel to. And so far as middle grade adventure graphic novels go, nothing's even come close. What starts out as a fairly low stakes adventure kind of just keeps escalating throughout the book and the series. But at the heart of it are these two unlikely best friends who just are the perfect polar opposites who complement each other so well. The anxiety representation in here is just beautiful. The friendship, the heart, everything about it. The artwork, it's just perfection. I love Lightfall. And I'm so happy that I reread it and got to experience it all over again. And then I also read some poetry this month. This is How Decent Folk Behave by Maxine Beneba Clarke. Maxine is one of my favorite authors, definitely my favorite Australian author. And I read this month because I got to go to a talk with Maxine at my local library this month. And I loved reading these poems on my own, but then going and listening to Maxine read some of them and talk about some of them definitely elevated my experience of this book overall. Essentially, this is a poetry collection that feels very collective. It's about the kind of collective experience of Australia through 2020. And so there are poems about COVID, about lockdown, about the Black Lives Matter protests, both what we watched happening in America, but also the movement happening here in Australia too. The Me Too movement, which coincided terrifyingly with a bunch of public space murders of women by strangers in Melbourne, to the climate protests that were happening, including the climate strikes for school students. A lot of these poems feel very anthemic. They're very strong and powerful. And I loved hearing Maxine talk about how she tried to kind of tap into that collective experience, but was very conscious of making sure that she was not excluding marginalized or underrepresented voices in that attempt to represent the collective, if that makes sense. One incredible example that we discussed a little bit at the event was one line in a poem about the murders of women in public spaces by strangers. There was quite a number of those murders, in quick succession in Melbourne. And in order to try and capture both the terror that so many women in Melbourne were feeling at that time, but also honor the fact that only particular kinds of women were mourned en masse in particular ways, while other women were almost forgotten. There's one line in that poem where Maxine talks about they were mourned on a sliding scale, dependent on their proximity to whiteness to middle classness. I cried multiple times reading this. I loved hearing Maxine talk about it, and this is just another like home run as far as I'm concerned for Maxine Beneba Clarke. I love her. I love her writing. I'd love to hear in the comments below if you had any standout reads of January. A big thank you to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie for their very generous support. And thank you for watching all the way to the end of this very long video. I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me, chatting books. I'll talk to you in the comments and in the next video. Until then, happy reading. Bye.